But I have been reading this passage a lot over the last year or so because it's been very fascinating to me. And so I'm going to be up here not so much to preach, but to just talk to you about what I see in this passage, in these verses. So first of all, I'm going to go to John chapter 9, and I don't even have a bookmark in my Bible because I looked at that section so many times that the pages are sticking out. I can find it pretty easy. I'm going to read you verses 1 through 7. Just a prelude to this, Jesus had just been hiding himself because they were trying to stone him. And he kind of hid in the crowd. And it says, and as he passed by, he saw a man blind from birth. And his disciples asked him, saying, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he should be born blind? Jesus answered, it was neither that this man sinned, nor his parents, but it was in order that the works of God might be displayed in him. We must work the works of him who sent me, as long as it is day. Night is coming when no man can work. While I am in the world, I am the light of the world. When he had said this, he spat on the ground and made clay of the spittle and applied the clay to his eyes and said to him, go wash in the pool of Siloam, which is translated sent. And so he went away and washed and came back seeing. So we got a couple lessons in there. One about the fact that you really can't judge people by their trouble in life. It's not always a sign of that they've done something wrong. We also see in that we need to be doing the works of God. And there's probably a few other things in there, and they're kind of plain. And then after that, we have a miracle. I called it a standard miracle when I first started reading this. You know, Jesus spits. Is that standard? I don't think that's standard. But Jesus spits. He makes clay. He puts the clay in the blind man's eyes, tells the blind man to wash, tells the blind man where to go to wash. The blind man goes away. The blind man washes. He comes back, and he sees. All laid out there in two verses. So we saw the works of God, right? Because he healed that man. And it's displayed in the blind man. He's the one who got healed. So it looks like we're finished, right? We can stop here. We can get out early. We can go beat the Presbyterians to the restaurants. And we're finished, right? That easy. I left a lot of room for you, Steve. But I want to maybe put a stop on that for a moment here because there's more in this chapter that goes with that story, so I guess it can't really be done there. Plus, I noticed that the miracle doesn't quite seem to fit the standard miracles that you see in other parts of the Bible, especially in other Gospels, not so much John. The one thing I don't see right off the bat is I don't see a crowd anywhere by. Now, if you're going to display the works of God, display kind of means to show everybody, right? But there's not a big crowd around there to see. At least it doesn't look like there is. I mean, the man is a beggar, and he may have been in a place where a lot of people are going by. But it doesn't seem like it's the normal thing you would see for seeing something being displayed out in the open. At least it doesn't describe it that way. So I'm going to read a little bit more, since I know there's more to read. And I'll read that, and let's see if that helps us a little bit. And this is verses 8 through 12. The neighbors, therefore, and those who previously saw him as a beggar were saying, is not this the one who used to sit and beg? Others were saying, this is he. And still others were saying, no, but he is like him. And he kept saying, I am the one. Therefore, they were saying to him, how then were your eyes opened? And he answered, the man who is called Jesus made clay and anointed my eyes and said to me, go to Siloam and wash. So I went away and washed, and I received sight. And they said to him, where is he? He said, I do not know. So you had to go through the story again because they wanted to add a little extra here maybe. But actually the difference is the first time we hear the story, John is telling us from the information that he has about what happened. And now we're hearing it directly from the blind man. And I want to point out that it's not as long when the blind man says it, because he makes his a little more cleaned up. He gets rid of the spitting. Okay? So if you didn't like the spitting, listen to the blind man and skip John's part. Now, I said I wasn't sure that there was a crowd around, and I don't know if there really was or not, but I do know this. It talks about his neighbors, people who would recognize him and know who he was and what he was doing. They were probably the people who were around where he begged. Probably that's the neighbors they're talking about. And they clearly didn't see what happened, did they? Because he went away to go wash and came back seeing, and clearly they missed out on what happened because they're asking him these questions. They didn't know. In fact, what they know about what happened comes from the testimony of the blind man. Not because they actually saw it, but because he told them about it. Now, they knew something had happened because they saw him before, so they knew enough about that, and they saw him after. In fact, when they saw him after, they were a little confused about who he was because he could see. But to get all the facts about who did this and what went on came from the testimony of the blind man. And in fact, the blind man even helps them to know who did it. So they clearly didn't see what happened. He ends up telling them that a man called Jesus was the healer. Now, I'm not sure how he knew that, because he was blind, but he must have heard Jesus' name throughout this. There's a second thing that kind of throws me off in this miracle, in terms of what's kind of standard for miracles, is that Jesus disappears. I don't know of any miracle where Jesus kind of does his thing and then doesn't hang around and people see that it was him that did it. He disappears, and the blind man, even when he comes back seeing, still hasn't seen Jesus. He doesn't know where he is, and I think it's kind of hard to display the God who healed you if you can't pick him out of the crowd and point to him and say, he's the one who did it. He says, I don't know where he is. That kind of throws me off for this being a standard miracle. Another thing that often happens when you read the miracles of Jesus, and this isn't every time, but usually you hear some kind of phrase like, your sins are forgiven, or your faith has made you well. And Jesus doesn't say any of that with this man. In fact, when we read it, Jesus is talking to his disciples, and he goes over and he sticks mud on the guy's eyes, and then he tells them what to do about it, to go wash. Now, in this day and age, if people did that to people who are on the streets or whatever, I would say that they're being cruel, that they're pulling some kind of prank and having fun at the expense of this person. I'm not sure what anybody around saw would have thought of that, but Jesus doesn't say anything about his faith or about his sins. He's just told to go wash. I have a fourth thing that also throws me off. By the way, with that whole thing of not hearing about his faith has made him well, I wonder if the man believes in Jesus at that point. I mean, it seems strange that there is no conversation about it. The last thing that I noticed is that Jesus comes to him. Now, that's not completely unusual for miracles, because we know that the man that was laying by the pool waiting to get help to walk by waiting for the waters to be disturbed by an angel, Jesus approached him. But that seems a little different, because Jesus asked him if he wanted to walk. And I don't see anywhere in here that Jesus asked this guy if he wanted to see. He just did what he did, and the man came back seeing. So, I'll read 13 through 16 because there's more to the story, and I want to make sure that we get out of here in time. No. This is verses 13 through 16. They brought to the Pharisee who was formerly blind, they brought to the Pharisees him who was formerly blind. That's kind of standard procedure when you've got some kind of miraculous event going on. You bring it to the Pharisees to show. Now, it was a Sabbath on the day when Jesus made the clay and opened his eyes. And that's key to what happens in the next parts, although I'm not going to emphasize it very much, but obviously they have a problem with him making clay. Verse 15. Yeah, 15, 16. Again, therefore, the Pharisees also were asking him how he received his sight. Oh no, we're going to have to hear it all over again. We've already heard it twice, now we're going to hear it a third time. And he said to them, he applied clay to my eyes, and I washed and I see. Well, that's not so bad. It's not as long as the other two. The story's getting shorter, but they did include the part about clay, and that's going to get the Pharisees all disturbed. Therefore, some of the Pharisees were saying, this man is not from God because he does not keep the Sabbath. But others were saying, how can a man who is a sinner perform such signs? And there was a division among them. So the Pharisees got word of what happened, and they are split about what he's doing. Has that ever happened with anyone else? Yeah. I want to point out that this issue of being divided on Jesus is throughout the Scripture. There are people really confused about him. In fact, I'm going to turn to John chapter 7, verses 40 to 43. It says here, some of the multitude, therefore, when they heard these words, were saying, this certainly is the prophet. Others were saying, well, this is the Christ. Still others were saying, surely the Christ is not going to come from Galilee, is he? Has not the Scripture said that the Christ comes from the offspring of David and from Bethlehem, the village where David was? So there arose a division in the multitude because of him. So the people are split about Jesus. Some not thinking he's so good, and some thinking, yeah, he's got to be the right guy. And the Pharisees were that way too. This event happens before the story we are in. But if we move to John chapter 10, we can see they're still divided about him. John chapter 10, verses 19 to 21. There arose a division. Oh, it's already said it right there. I don't know if I need to read more. There arose a division again among the Jews because of these words. And many of them were saying, he has a demon and is insane. Well, that's a lot stronger than what they said before. Why do you listen to him? Others were saying, these are not the sayings of one demon-possessed. A demon cannot open the eyes of the blind, can he? So even with the story of the blind man, all throughout this whole section, there's confusion, and there's division among people talking about him, and they're not sure what to do with him. Okay. So I'm going to read verses 17 to 24 because now we bring in the parents into the situation. And in 17, it starts off, it says, they said, therefore, to the blind man again, what do you say about him since he opened your eyes? And he said, he is a prophet. The Jews, therefore, did not believe it of him, and that he had been blind and had received sight. And so they called the parents of the very one who had received his sight. And they questioned them, saying, is this your son, who you say was born blind? Then how does he now see? His parents answered them and said, we know that this is our son, and that he was born blind. But how he now sees, we do not know. Or who opened his eyes, we do not know. Ask him, he is of age, he shall speak for himself. It says his parents said this because they were afraid of the Jews. For the Jews had already agreed that if anyone should confess him to be the Christ, he should be put out of the synagogue. For this reason his parents said, he is of age, ask him. So a second time they called the man who had been blind and said to him, give glory to God, we know that this man is a sinner. Interesting that they would give glory about that, but I think that's intended to say that God did this, but not this man. It's important to note that we have the word of the blind man, that he was healed by the actions that he did, and that Jesus was the one that did it. We have the neighbors who know what he was like before he could see and what he looked like after. So they had some idea that this is the guy. But you can't ask for better proof about who this guy is than his parents. His parents are the proof that he is who he says he is, that he's the guy who is blind, and that he can now see. It's sad that they were afraid to give any credit to Jesus for this, but they did have some very real fears about what would happen to them if they did that. And now, I also want to point out here, I guess, that it's important in that section I just read that the blind man identifies Jesus as a prophet. When you get to the end of that section that I just read, the Pharisees identify him as a sinner. They are not on the same page. They're all going different directions about how they see him, and even they are divided between the blind man and the Pharisees. Verse 25 says, he therefore answered, whether he is a sinner, I do not know. One thing I do know, that whereas I was blind, now I see. That is the final succinct version of what happened. We got all that big long section about the spitting, but in the end, the essence of the story is that man was blind, and now he sees. And it's because of the person that they're calling a sinner. Verses 26 to 33, it says, they said therefore to him, what did he do to you? How did he open your eyes? Oh no. They're asking this again. You've already heard in 4 different versions here. Fortunately, the blind man saves us. He answered them, I told you already, and you did not listen. Why do you want to hear it again? You do not want to become his disciples too, do you? I don't have any jokes, but this story is funny. And they reviled him and said, you are his disciples, but we are disciples of Moses. We know that God has spoken to Moses, but as for this man, we did not know where he is from. And the man answered and said to them, well, here is an amazing thing, that you do not know where he is from, and yet he opened my eyes. We know that God does not hear sinners, but if anyone is God-fearing and does his will, he hears him. Since the beginning of time, it has never been heard that anyone opened the eyes of a person born blind. If this man were not from God, he could do nothing. I find it a fascinating section to see this discussion. I kind of wondered about the idea that that he said what he said to them about, I already told you this. Why are you asking again? I can't help but think that he knew that when he said, you want to be his disciples too, that he was not serious about that. I don't think he was serious about that. But it's kind of interesting because if he's a beggar, he's probably outside the temple or outside the council, and he's constantly asking for money and alms and things from these guys here. These are the ones that are paying him. He's biting the hand that feeds him. But I think that he's come to the conclusion that he's biting the hands that are not really feeding him, but they're actually destroying him because they're not taking him down the right path. It's interesting to note that in this section that the Pharisees say they don't know where he's from. They've already declared him a sinner, but they say they don't know where he's from. And the blind man answers that with, well, he must be from God. Where else could he be from? Can't you guys see this? He could see, but they could not see this. So let's finish this out here. Verses 35 to 38. I'm not going to go past 38 because the blind man drops out of the story after that point. And although there's good things to learn from after that, I want to talk about what's happening with the blind man. 35 to 38 says, Jesus heard, first let's start with 34. They answered and said to him, you are born entirely in sins, and are you teaching us? And they put him out. I do want to point out that that's not how this story started, that they were concerned that this man was born in sins, and Jesus had to correct that view. But the Pharisees think that. They think that about him completely. Jesus heard that they had put him out, and finding him, he said, do you believe in the Son of Man? He answered and said, and who is he, Lord, that I may believe in him? Jesus said to him, you have both seen him, and he is the one who is talking with you. And he said, Lord, I believe. And he worshiped him. It's kind of interesting that Jesus approaches the blind man again, right? I mean, at the beginning of the story, it's Jesus who went over and stuck the mud on his eyes. At the end of the story, he comes and finds him again. It doesn't say that the man was looking for him. But now that the blind man can finally see Jesus, he is ready to say that he believes in him. He's already been talking to his neighbors. He's already been talking to the Pharisees. He finally sees Jesus. And he's gone through this progression of, I believe, some change. I believe he's changed in how he sees Jesus through the process. At the beginning of this, I talked about some lessons that were learned from this about that you can't judge people because of their troubles, because that's not necessarily what's happening there. They're not necessarily doing something wrong to have it happen. The other part of that is that he was blind so that the works of God could be displayed. And the first thing I think of is, he's not blind anymore. That was the works of God. I think everybody would agree. Check mark. That's the work of God right there. And also, we must do the works of God, and Jesus did that for him. But I think besides him being able to see, there's more at work here. Maybe a lot of people didn't see it at the beginning, what happened to him. So what ends up happening after that? He goes out and talks with his neighbors and gives his testimony. They knew what he was like before he had the miracle happen to him, and they knew what he was like after the miracle, but they did not know all the details in between. And how did they find out? The blind man told them. He is displaying the works of God for them. He's giving his testimony about what happened. And another part of displaying the works of God here, doing the works of God, is the blind man himself. He started off with no declaration at all of any faith at the beginning of this. He calls Jesus, the person who healed him, he calls him, he's a man called Jesus. That's what he refers to him as. Then he declares him as a prophet. Then he tells the Pharisees, Jesus must be from God. And finally, he tells Jesus he believes and he worships him. I think this whole process was meant to bring that man into believing Jesus. That the works of God weren't just the fact that he could see with his eyes, but he could see with his spirit that Jesus was the Son of God. And I think it's important to know that we have that effect on people too with our testimony. There are people who don't know things about God, about Jesus. They didn't see it, they don't know it, but we can talk to them about what's happening in our lives, and we can talk to them about what's in the Bible, so they can have the testimony that can take them down the path to believing. When people ask Heidi and I, how many children we have, five. We have one in heaven. Our son Samuel was born with trisomy 18. He lived to be 9 years old. When he was born, with a parade of anomalies and dysfunctional parts of his body, we said to ourselves, what did we do wrong? Did we do something unhealthy? Is this punishment for something we've done? Because of Sam, we have connected to a lot of people, a lot of doctors and nurses. Sorry. Other parents with similar children, we've talked with them. And my wife still is connected to a lot of them today on Facebook. I'm not so connected. And at times we even meet up with those people if we go to their conferences. We haven't been for a while, but we're in contact with them. And there were many people who came into our house to help us with our son. I believe that Sam's condition was to display the works of God in him and in us. I believe in Jesus, and I'm thankful for what Jesus did for me, and I'm thankful for all of my children. I don't have any regrets or struggles with that, other than the sadness I might feel missing them. But I just want to say that God does a lot of things, and if you're struggling with stuff in life and you're kind of wondering, why is this happening to me? Just remember that God does many things in this world so that we can display the works of God. And we need to be doing the works of God. Thank you.